Hello, welcome to our special bonus Q&A module for Talk Story. Today you're going to find out how to polish, edit, and research writing markets with an editor. I'd like to introduce Jill Twist. She's a working editor, and besides editing, Jill is an author whose poetry and prose have been published online and in print. Jill works with first-time writers and seasoned writers, too, to help them develop and polish their stories. She's particularly interested in working on short stories, literary fiction, and translation. Now let's hear from Jill. Thank you. Hi, Jill. Thank you for being here. And I'd like to start with a first question that I know that most everybody would be asking right off the bat. My story is done. It's ready to go to editing. What do I do now?
Right, that's a great beginning question. And I know that in your course, you talk about reading the story aloud and letting it sit. And these are both important steps and definitely help to get your writing polished. But once you've done all that and you still want to bring your story forward, here are two things that you can do next. Number one, research markets. And number two, get your story ready to send to these markets.
Well, that sounds good. How do I do all of that?
That's a good question. Lots of writers use professional editors to help them polish their stories. Editing involves a lot more than just checking for commas and periods. It can help your story evolve through the sticky spots so your writing reaches surprising places and is more memorable to readers and to the editors of magazines that you might potentially send to. But before you contact an editor, I encourage you to look at your story closely. Jot down the spots that feel stuck. Are there slow parts or unnecessary parts, parts that are flat that might need a bit of excitement? Is there tension? Knowing the areas of your story that you want to improve can help you decide what sort of editing that will be most useful to you. It's also helpful to know the basic process of editing before you contact an editor. Often, editors use different terms for different types of editing, and this can be frustrating for authors, but you can avoid this frustration if one, you know the type of input you're looking for, and two, have a general idea of the different stages of editing. You don't have to worry so much about the names of each stage. Focus more on the type of issues each stage addresses. Here are three major stages of editing. 1. Developmental editing. Are you in your first or second draft? Does your story have a lot of tangents, no clear arc, no tension, no character depth? This type of editing helps build depth and clarity. It's called developmental editing because your story is still developing. An editor won't write the story for you, but can help guide you by pointing out big picture issues and offering steps you can take to address these issues. For this type of edit, an editor would write a very detailed letter summarizing your story's strengths and areas for improvement. Lots of feedback that I give in a developmental edit are questions the author might consider while revising the story. This edit may also include marginal notes in the story. These notes offer additional details and comments, as well as highlighting specific passages that you might consider adding or removing. Now, the second stage of the second stage of editing is called copy editing. Is English your second language? Is English your first language, but do you stumble over words like there, and there? Or do you have so many character and place names in your story that you have a hard time keeping track of them? Copy editors help polish the language on the page and make sure all the facts and names are consistent. To get the most out of a copy edit, you should feel confident with the overall arc of your story. If you still need to address big picture issues like pacing, structure, voice, then you're not quite ready for a copy edit. A copy edit is often a 3-step process. The first step being the editor reviews your work, marking the manuscript, asking questions. They should also create what's called a style sheet, in which they list the names and important plot points that helps the editor maintain consistency. This style sheet is helpful with short stories, but it's really essential with longer works like novels. The second step is when the writer reviews the marked up manuscript and revises. But the third step, this is the one that often gets overlooked, but is an important step. The editor reviews the work a second time, cleaning up the changes that you've made during your revision. Now, a third type of editing is called proofreading. This is the word I think that most authors think of when they think of editing, but what they have in mind is actually closer to a copy edit. Here's what proofreading actually is. Before a book is published, the text is transferred from a writing program like Microsoft Word into a format that looks like a book with other graphic elements like illustrations, page numbers, and importantly, page breaks and chapter breaks. This process, it's called typesetting. This is usually the first time the text is broken into book-sized pages. Errors do occur in this process, and errors that were not caught during a previous revision suddenly appear obvious on the printed page, which is why a proofreader reviews a hard copy of the manuscript for all elements, including text and graphics, with special attention to filling in any holes. A proofreader uses special marks in the margin that may look a little unusual, but is really just shorthand. So that's a summary of the basic stages of editing that you might keep in mind when you contact an editor.
That sounds really good, Jill. What I want to know next is how do I find a professional editor, someone who works with new authors like me and is interested in short story types of editing? Can you enlighten us a little bit on that?
Yeah, those are some great questions. There are many editors out there, but it's important to find the right editor for you. Some specialize in working with new authors. Some specialize in specific genres like science fiction or romance or nonfiction. When you're ready to look for an editor, here are 2 of the safest ways to find a trusted editor. First, ask around. Ask people you trust. Ask your writing teacher and fellow writers. Ask at your local library and your bookstore. Who have they worked with? Did they have a good experience? And the second way is look for a professional editing association. I belong to the Northwest Editing Guild, which required me to have a certain amount of experience before I was invited to join.
All right, that sounds great. Now, you've mentioned hiring an editor. If I do that, what can I expect? What's the process that goes along with hiring an editor to help me with my stories?
Yeah, so that's again great questions, but let's back up a minute. If you contacted me, for example, for editing work, here are a few things we would do before we agreed to an edit. First, we'd talk. I would ask you questions about your story and about you as a writer. Are you a first time author? Have you worked with a professional editor before? Have you worked with an editor on this specific story before? What sort of input are you looking for? Do you have a specific market in mind? Your answers to questions like these would help us move forward. Next, I would ask you to see the writing. For a short story, I would ask to see the entire story, but for a novel, I'd usually ask to see several chapters. Seeing your writing is really the best way for me to estimate my time and rate. Next, depending on the edit you're interested in, my rate might be an estimate. I like to charge a flat fee so that authors know upfront how much the total cost will be. But in certain instances, charging hourly is more fair to both the author and me. And actually, while we're on the topic of rates, two interesting organizations you might want to explore to get an idea of rates are the Editors Freelance Association and the Northwest Editors Guild. Both of these associations offer current going rates for the different types of editing that I talked about earlier. So, and this is important when you go in and talk with an editor because this is a profession. So it's good for you to know what to expect general ranges to be are when you go in to work with an editor. And after the rates are set and the timeline is set, I would send you a one-page letter of agreement that clearly states the type of edit I'll provide. Then I'll edit, and I might reach out with a question or two, but usually I'll work alone until I'm ready to send the manuscript back to you. Depending on the services we agree to, you and I might meet afterward or discuss the edit by phone, but then you're ready to revise.
All right, that sounds great. Now listen, you mentioned markets. I know about book publisher markets, but what about the literary market, the literary magazine market? How do I find a magazine that fits my needs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first, I would just say that with short stories, literary magazines, which is just magazines that often publish creative writing as well as art and photography of contemporary writers, those that are writing currently right now. Short stories are a great fit for these magazines because the magazines are short and often the short stories are quite short as well. So I'll get in and answer that earlier question about literary magazines. Many magazines focus on publishing new writers, or they might focus on specific themes. So it's really to your benefit to do your research first. One way to get started to do the preliminary research is just do a basic internet search, including keywords, for example, literary magazine, science fiction, or literary magazine, new writers, Japan. Jot down the results. So many magazines have websites now, so browsing the websites of these magazines is really easier than ever. Be sure to read a few stories that a magazine has published to get a feel for what they're looking for. Here's a secret hint. Take a look at the contributors. Most magazines include short biographies for each contributor. Are they new writers like you? Where else have they been published? Jot the names of these magazines down too. Then check at your local library and bookstore to see if they subscribe to any of these magazines or another that might interest you. If they don't, they might consider a trial subscription. This would be a great way for you to learn a magazine more. Last, now that you've found a few potential markets, read the submission guides carefully.
All right, that brings us right down to submitting. So my story is done, it's written, it's edited, it's revised, and now I want to submit it. What do I need to know to do that?
Yeah, so the first thing I would tell you is submitting is not scary. It might seem like that at first, but really, many magazines have the same guidelines, so your approach will be similar across the board. So here are a few common things and buzzwords to watch out for. Word and page count. If a magazine lists a word or page limit for stories, be sure your story doesn't exceed this number. Single submission. Usually you can send one story at a time to a magazine. Simultaneous submission. Now, on the surface, this seems very similar to the last point, but it's different. Most magazines allow you to send your story to other markets while it's still under review at their magazine, but a very few do not allow simultaneous submissions, meaning you must wait until you hear back from one magazine before you submit to another. Previously unpublished. If you post a story on a personal blog or social media site, magazines consider this story already published. Because they receive so many great submissions, most magazines only consider previously unpublished writing. So be careful about how you share your writing before it's published. Submission window. If a magazine accepts submissions year-round, it will specify. If it accepts submissions only at a certain time of the year, it will also specify deadlines. How to submit. Most magazines accept only online submissions through a website called Submittable, but a very few require you to print your story and mail it to the magazine office. Cover letter. This is a 1 or 2 sentence note addressing the magazine. I keep my cover letters very short and always thank the magazine for their time. One thing about this process to keep in mind is it's very common for American literary magazines to charge a small fee, usually $3 for each submission, to cover the cost of the website that manages the submissions. However, a new trend that I've noticed is that some magazines are offering a free window to writers of hardship that are not able to pay the $3. They really don't want a barrier in place. This is just that nominal fee of $3 is something that, as a nonprofit magazine, they really have to keep going just to cover their own costs. And another thing to keep in mind, this is something that's hard to remember, but I think important to know, is that many magazines take 4 to 6 months or longer to reply. They receive so many submissions, their small staff can't possibly reply, unfortunately, in depth to each author. So don't get discouraged if you receive a very formal and impersonal reply. Many magazines look for specific things in what they publish, such as a strong voice or a specific theme. Hundreds of authors submit their work to each magazine, and each magazine can only publish a very small sample of what is submitted, so keep trying. And even if you do get published, keep writing and keep trying. That's my advice to you and your students. I hope this helps.
Well, so far so good. I know that I've gotten discouraged sometimes when I submit, and I keep trying too. So
Yeah.
that's the best advice. Well, okay. Jill, I really appreciate you doing this. I can't tell you how much this has been helpful, not only to me, but I think to the new authors out there in the world. So how can writers contact you if they're interested in your services? How can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, if someone's interested in contacting me specifically or just learning more about editing or to find other editors, I would reroute you to that link on your flyer to the Northwest Editors Guild, or search the internet directly, Northwest Editors Guild, and that way you can search my name, you can search today's current rates for different stages of editing, or you can search for other editors by genre, such as short story, or by themes such as science fiction or romance. That would be the first step, I think, in connecting with an editor.
Okay, great. And I'll leave a link after our interview for anyone who's interested in searching that website. Again, Jill, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your help and your wonderful advice.
It was my pleasure. Good luck.